Dennis McRae is Senior Director of Consumer and Industrial Products with West Monroe. And our topic today is manufacturing coming back to the United States or not. Dennis, hello. Greetings.
Good afternoon.
Let's start with a specific example, and that is the announcement of the possibility that Intel might come back to the U.S. in chip manufacturing. Is that a feasible or possible thing, either Intel specifically or chip manufacturing in general?
Yeah, I think it's very visible. And I think if you start to look at the trends for reshoring and what's happened in the last 20, 25 years, that really starts to provide a grounds for why it is feasible. At the same time, if you think about what's happening in industry and technology over the last 10 to 15 years, there's been advances that have been made that allow that kind of manufacturing to come back to the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
The other side I would say is, I'll talk.
Go on. Sorry, please complete that thought.
Yeah, so I think, the important thing is, as we look at it, the biggest driver for offshoring historically has been cost. So if you look at the two major outflows of manufacturing jobs, the first one was around 1999, 2000, around the 9/11, and we lost about 22% of our manufacturing base to overseas jobs. The second one was around 2008, 2009, where we lost another percent of our jobs, again, due to recessionary period and the housing bubble burst. But those two things actually drove manufacturers to look outside of the U.S. to drive lower costs for the manufacturing. And that's how they've achieved it, to go into lower cost manufacturing regions. And if you think about that, it's primarily cost. And so the biggest biggest thing driving where manufacturing occurs is cost. I mean, that is the biggest and number one variable in equipment manufacturers. Mm-hmm. However, the thing that's interesting is if you think about Industry 4.0 and Manufacturing 4.0, these new advances in manufacturing that have been made over the last 15 years, they're actually going to enable a mega trend that I refer to as regional supply chains. So, the idea of bringing back high-tech manufacturing to the U.S. is very feasible. And in fact, it would be done in a way that's not done as it is, for example, in Taiwan or China, et cetera. It would be done, much more differently through additive type manufacturing and more advanced technologies that allow it to be much more feasible. And so the idea, though, is as you actually start to drive towards these new capabilities of being able to make an entire product within a region, specialize it, customize it, do all these things. In my opinion, everything that I'm seeing, and you'll see other people within the market talk about this, but it's the technology that's going to enable it, and in fact, it's going to make it inevitable to have to reshore these types of manufacturing abilities back to the U.S.
Well, is it a question of the fact that the cost is no longer quite so advantageous because costs are going up for production in Asia, wages are going up, or is it more that beyond the comparison of labor, other issues arose such as length of supply chain, risk to disruption, that type of thing?
I think all factors, yes. I mean, those are all factors that have happened over the last kind of 10, 15 years. But when you think about what technology is going to do in terms of creating these regional supply chains, for example, if we can, make a chip through additive manufacturing, and then, which is effectively 3D printing a chip, and we don't need the surrounding, technical components around it, it becomes much more feasible to make that here in the U.S. Then all of the supply, all the variability that you talk about, the risk in the supply chain, the working capital tied up in all these, chips being transported from point A to point B, all of that goes away because you're in a regional supply chain, all that cost goes away. So that even makes it much more effective to produce regionally. Mm-hmm. So I think, given the advances in technology and that need, you're going to start to see it come back this way. I'm sorry, go ahead.
But not necessarily fantastic news for U.S. workers who thinks that would mean an enormous amount of new job opportunities, because the production facilities that you're talking about would probably be highly automated and involve relatively few people, right?
Well, actually, that they are, but even though they are highly automated, when you start to think about lights out manufacturing, where manufacturing is done autonomously, That is happening. And in fact, they're big retailers. Some of the biggest retailers in the world are even trying to get into that space in terms of, taking their retail, move upstream into the manufacturing side of it. But the brilliant thing about this is these are the types of jobs we want to have in the U.S. in the future. And in fact, it'll create more jobs. So, as you create automated machinery, it doesn't maintain itself. It requires, advanced capabilities around maintenance, et cetera, to be able to maintain that type of equipment. So what it is a higher paid technical jobs to support the manufacturing, what we call the operational technology base.
Mhm. It's interesting too, in manufacturing, we talk about the need for entire supplier campuses. Like, for instance, let's say you bring chip manufacturing back to the United States. Well, those chips are feeding another manufacturing facility making high-end, high-tech products. I take it that those facilities also would be in the US. You're talking about like all the different stages of manufacturing all here now, coming here now, or would some of that still
Yeah.
be offshore?
Well, I would say the thing that precludes it, and the one variable that stands out, there are two variables that stand out in terms of location of selecting where you manufacture. The other one is just raw material availability. So, if, for example, silicone can only be mined in a certain area, it's going to have to be mined there and smelted and taken to the manufacturing facility.
Mhm.
The other side of it, I would say, is environmental health safety regulations. As we advance toward more advanced manufacturing, as I'm describing, kind of additive manufacturing, 3D printing, a lot of the negative side impacts of plating things, toxic chemicals go away, and so that affords it to come back here also. I mean, when you think about other countries when we offshore, they're able to take on. I mean, they have their regulations are much less stringent, and they're able to take on those kind of activity. And plating, for example, within metal is something that I'd be surprised if that comes back to the U.S. anytime, because the toxic levels of
Mhm.
around that type of
Well,
manufacturing
as long as we're
process.
talking about that, what about the moves we've seen recently to bring the rare earth supply chain to the United States in terms of mining and processing and alloys and rare earth magnets? There are attempts to do that. That would bring a serious source of raw materials back to the country, but might also raise environmental concerns. So, what do you think is going to happen there?
It potentially could. That's true. I think in that case, it's really about, again, it comes back to cost and what's the cost to benefit of bringing that back into the U.S. And
Hmm.
over time, what you will see. I mean, and you've seen this, and we've seen this over the last 50 to 75 years. But environmental regulations change over time, right? And that's going to change globally. So at some point, that will sustain and stabilize. But I think there's going to be gaps and periods in time where it is more regionalized within a certain part of the world. If that makes
Yeah.
sense.
There is, of course, a third option, and that is nearshoring, not bringing back to the United States, but maybe close to the United States, like Mexico. What are the possibilities that we're seeing a significant amount of manufacturing go that route?
I think that's very feasible too, right? I mean, and that's what nearshoring is very similar to what I call regional supply chains, and some of it could be made in the U.S. and some of it could be made right at the border, where it might make sense to have lower cost labor that can assemble parts, those kind of. But what I think the big change, and again, it's going to be driven by technology. And I haven't talked about a lot of them, but when we talk about advanced manufacturing, kind of light manufacturing, and we talk about digital twins, which the ability to actually model and monitor and optimize the supply chain in a way that only maybe 5 or 10% businesses are doing today. That all enables us to be able to drive that cost down for that manufacturing. So nearshoring is very much a possibility in regional supply chain.
Do you think it would be overstating the case to think that this might be part of a larger picture of a total rethinking of the whole concept of globalization, that localized production will be a big thing in all countries going forward, maybe in part because of trade wars, because of the pandemic, because of technology,
Yeah,
because of labor issues? Do you think we're seeing a whole new paradigm shift on this globalization thing going forward?
I do. Yeah, this is a completely different environment, and I think this convergence of both technology and pandemic environment risk to global supply chains. We're going I see these changes happen very quickly over the next 5 years.
Well, how interesting. It's going to be very exciting to see these changes because we've been going one way for so long, and now it looks like we're in for a major shift because of all these factors we've been talking about. Dennis McRae of West Monroe, I want to thank you so much for elucidating these issues for us and being with us today. Thanks very much. Appreciate it.
Bob, thanks for taking the time with me.